And comrades, I'm unfortunately had to step in at very short notice because Grace Cohen, who was to speak to us from the Stop the War Coalition as one of the National Steering Committee members, has fallen ill. She's sent her apology. She said she's really sorry to miss our meeting this evening. Best wishes to Grace for a swift recovery. So my name is Ruben Brett. I'm an activist with Stop the War Coalition, Brighton hosts Stop the War Coalition, the local branch, and I'm the treasurer for the local branch. I'm also a UNISON rep and a member of the Central Council of Liberation, which Brian Leishman was to speak to us this evening from as well. Unfortunately, he couldn't attend either, and our thoughts go to him. So about the Stop the War Coalition, it was formed in 2001 to unite the opposition to the illegal invasion of Iraq, and since then it's campaigned against UK involvement in all wars around the world, and notably had success in stopping UK military intervention in Syria in 2013. But it's been a lot of constant struggle against wars because our government are always getting themselves involved in wars. And warfare is not just military intervention, it's also economic warfare. Both Liberation and Stop the War Coalition have a priority aim to establish a progressive foreign policy independent of Washington. One of the fundamental aspects of such a policy is to end the UK's complicity in US economic warfare and the UK's own use of economic warfare, as well as direct military intervention. Economic warfare is carried out mainly through unilateral coercive measures, as we've heard. These are against international law. Regardless, by the end of 2023, there were 560 unilateral sanctions in force against nation states, compared with 36 UN sanctions, which are those considered multilateral and legal. That's not to say they're necessarily more ethical, especially as the Security Council itself has been dominated by imperialist powers, but they're the ones that are legitimate within the world system. But there are 560 in force at the end of 2023 that were not in that category. And 405 of those were accounted for by the UK, US and EU alone, 282 by the US alone, while other countries apply them quite sparingly in contrast. And that includes hundreds of measures against individual countries, including Cuba. The UK is also one of the major users of unilateral sanctions against developing countries. It had 56 in force at the end of 2023, mostly against, as I said, developing countries. We've heard a little about Nicaragua, about Cuba, about Venezuela. Some of the other countries that are among the most heavily sanctioned are North Korea, Russia, Iran, among others. Much of the academic literature on unilateral coercive measures focuses not on the legality or the ethics, but the efficacy of sanctions or the lack of efficacy. And it's notable that, at least in the case of conventional sanctions, they're rarely successful in forcing the policy changes that are named as objectives. But in many cases, sanctions can be seen as having another objective, and we've heard about that as well: the immiseration of the population in the target country, the degradation of living standards, the destabilization of national life, with the eventual aim being regime change in favor of the US-led bloc. And this is what the US explicitly set out to do to Cuba in the 1960s, according to internal documents from that time. But despite imposing that immense suffering that we've just heard about on the Cuban people for 6.5 decades now, the US has not managed to bring about the change that it wanted, the overthrow of the revolutionary government. And Cuba has stuck to its sovereignty and self-determination. It may be a little different for Trump's tariff tactics, which are something new, but part of the overall body of unilateral coercive measures taken more broadly and part of economic warfare. Trump's threats of tariffs do seem to have forced changes of attitude from countries including Panama, Canada, recently Belgium, which all but spelled this out in explaining its decision to close its embassy in Cuba, based on the transactional nature of the new style of diplomacy, and I can't remember quite exactly, but in general, sanctions cause misery to populations, and especially to the most vulnerable parts of the population, regardless of the effect on the government, and the effect of the government may vary. In the case of sanctions on Russia, along with the direct impact of the war in Ukraine on both Russian and Ukrainian exports, the sanctions have led to spiking grain prices and food insecurity across much of the global south. In the case of Iran, sanctions have exacerbated economic crisis and pushed millions of people, by some estimates more than 80% of Iranians, into poverty. The comprehensive economic, financial and commercial blockade on Cuba costs the island $500,000 per hour, causes deaths from preventable illnesses, and stifles development. Sanctions on Venezuela have stunted the country's economic recovery after the crisis, which was itself triggered by a tumble in oil prices engineered by US allies in 2014. And along with, as I said, establishing an independent foreign policy, another priority of the Stop the War Coalition is to oppose and prevent any escalation of aggression against China and North Korea. Unilateral US sanctions on North Korea in the 1990s, together with US efforts to prevent aid entering the territory, led to increased poverty and deaths from the worst period of economic crisis there. There have since been continued sanctions with effects on economic development and widespread effects on the population. With regard to China, the UK's attitude has shifted dramatically from the Cameron government, in line with the US's pivot to Asia. While not imposing formal sanctions, there's been pressure from central government to reduce procurement from China, particularly from the Xinjiang region, to which the US and EU have both applied sanctions, largely of the so-called Magnitsky type, which formally target individuals and organizations rather than the states. In the context of China's market economy, this has harmed workers, particularly in Xinjiang, and Uyghur workers elsewhere in China, since employing them becomes a risk for any company trading internationally. And this is part of the overall ramping up of attacks on China and attacks on China-aligned countries in Asia. Trump's second term has seen the use of economic tariffs also as coercive measures, and these differ from conventional sanctions, but they have many of the same features and devastating effects on the economies which are targeted. Trump has attempted to impose staggering sums in politically motivated tariffs on China, Brazil, Mexico, and other countries. A lot of countries, almost every country, in fact, aiming to force changes of policy to conform to US interests. And so aspects of Trump's approach are new, but overall he continues the trend of US attempts to maintain world domination in disregard of international law, dating to before international law even existed in its current form, and dating back to, for example, the Monroe Doctrine in the Americas from 1823. We've recently seen the most horrific and outrageous escalations of US aggression in the Caribbean against Venezuela, both in direct military strikes and in the escalation of the US sanctions regime, with this being supplemented with new tariffs and secondary tariffs of 25% on any country buying Venezuelan petrochemicals, as well as in the nakedly self-interested US support for right-wing political opposition inside Venezuela. And the new tariffs are cumulative with not only the existing sanctions, but also the other tariffs applied to those third countries, and this aims to exert overwhelming pressure to isolate Venezuela internationally. So here in Britain, we have to be prepared to resist any UK involvement or support for a direct war on Venezuela. And ahead of any such eventuality, we have to be very clear and very insistent in demanding the UK government both clearly condemn the US use of hybrid warfare, including economic warfare against Venezuela, and to cease the UK's own involvement, which includes the continued illegal seizure of Venezuelan gold reserves in the Bank of England. The International Day Against Unilateral Coercive Measures, which takes place for the first time today, is an initiative proposed by Venezuela at the UN General Assembly in June and supported by over 100 countries, including Cuba and Palestine. Following a vote, it became an official United Nations observation to be marked annually on the 4th of December. The support of the Palestinian political leadership is particularly important to recognise because unilateral coercive measures are clearly distinguished from the multilateral measures against Israel in response to its continuing occupation, apartheid and genocide, sanctions approved by the UN General Assembly. UN member states are empowered by the General Assembly to impose sanctions on Israel legitimately in order to force Israel to cease violations of international law. This is in stark contrast to US, EU and UK unilateral sanctions, which are a means of economic warfare and seek to achieve political aims in violation of international law. It's important for us to mark this day and make our opposition to unilateral coercive measures loud and clear, while continuing to call for the UK to uphold its responsibilities and impose sanctions on Israel to enforce international law. Long live Palestine, long live Cuba, long live freedom, down with imperialism.